I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the libertarian perspective on the burning issues of the day. I'm joined as always by my co-host Richard Eppeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel. Richard, welcome back for another round of Libertarian Angle.
It's always great to be with you, Jacob, and our viewers and listeners. Well, the viewers and listeners, I don't know about you, but I'm set to go.
Good, because I was about to say, you got the same shtick every week, and I'm glad you changed it around a little bit.
I'm the libertarian Henny Youngman. I use the same material for the last 40 years. Okay.
Well, at least you're not looking at a teleprompter, like the pros do.
I'm just scared that some of our listeners and viewers don't know who Henny Youngman was. Oh God, I'm old. I'm old.
Yeah, at least the 98-year-olds that are watching the show will know exactly what you're talking about.
Thank you, Jacob. Thank you.
All right, Richard, big news all over the headlines, taking up pages and pages of newsprint and a large portion of the internet, the famous Brexit vote. And I've read a lot of stuff on this over the last couple of days, but I have to say, and I hate to give you kudos because I know it does what it does to your head, but the article that you sent us today is the best analysis I have yet seen on what is going on with this Brexit vote. For those of you that get our FFF daily, it'll be coming in your email box in a few minutes. But if you don't get it, I would advise you to subscribe to it. It's free. But in any event, it's on our website, on our homepage, and it's an article by Richard that analyzes this whole thing of the European Union, the vote by the British people to exit from there, and it's fantastic. So, Richard, why don't I turn it over to you and give us a synopsis of what you wrote in this article and what you see is going on with this Brexit vote.
Well, thank you for the compliments, Jacob. I know it's very hard for you to do.
It really is.
I know. But obviously, the news covered here in America and certainly in Europe has been this extraordinary circumstance that the United Kingdom, that is Great Britain, voted in a referendum this past Thursday on the issue of whether the United Kingdom would remain part of the European Union or leave the membership. And amazingly, and to the shock and surprise, and virtually the hysteria of the mainstream media, the political establishment, the elite insiders, and certainly the bureaucrats and commissioners of the European Union, were shocked to discover that the vote, though a narrow one, remained nonetheless just shy of 52% for leaving the European Union, and for the UK to leave and go its own way politically and economically. Now, let me sort of, if I may, Jacob, for the viewers and listeners who may not know too much, haven't had a chance to read articles like my own about this, what is the European Union? It's bandied about, but most people just perhaps don't know. In the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, there was an attempt in the late 1940s and early 1950s to arrange sort of an economic free trade arrangement between France and what was then West Germany. The idea is that to get over the scars of war for both countries, and through an economic interdependency, a very reasonable classical liberal free trade notion, through an economic interdependency, there would be diminished motives or benefits from war. Once nations as well as people are interdependent through a division of labor, you think twice before incurring the cost of going to war with your neighbors who are now both your suppliers as well as your customers. Quite reasonable in that sense. In around 1957, this was expanded to a number of Western European countries into what was called the European Economic Community, then known more generally as the Common Market. Its premise was that it would be a free trade zone. There was no notions of political integration, political correctness through cultural control, but that this would be a way of lowering trade barriers between a growing number of Western European countries for further economic, cooperative, and peaceful division of labor integration. So far, so good, if you will, for the most part. But as the 1960s and 70s came in, and certainly into the 1980s, there was this idea of making this a much more integrated and fully bound together political union, as well as an economic union. And so in the early 1990s, the common market, the European Economic Community, was transformed into the European Union, the EU. Now, what this involved was slowly but surely through the 1990s, the establishment of a bureaucracy in the European Union headquarters of Brussels, of increasingly, as people were hired to fill the bureaucracies, of literally tens of thousands of European Union employed bureaucrats, responsible not just to oversee that everybody was obeying, the free trade rules among the member nations, but increasingly micromanaging through government intervention, regulation control, that is European Union administration, the economic affairs of the citizenry, from the minute to the most profound. Then they extended that with the idea of that there would also be sort of political correctness unification, not just uniform rules and regulations about manufacturing, production, sale of goods and services, and so on across the member countries, but sort of a common code of their definition of the modern notion of civil liberties, which is not just freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, which has been part of that for the Europeans, but the idea of political correctness, of group identities, group privileges, group favors, having nothing to do with freedom of association and freedom of exchange and enterprise. And then, of course, emerged at the beginning of this century, in its formal form, a unified currency, the euro, which the United Kingdom, Great Britain, has always remained outside of. But increasingly, as power has been concentrated in this economic and cultural, and now expandingly political sense, out of Brussels, through the European commissions that oversee all of this, the European Union bureaucracies who micromanage it on an everyday basis, there has been a backlash in the sense that there have been people in the member countries that have increasingly come to be irritated by, feel uncomfortable with, angry with this idea that this seemingly uncontrollable bureaucracy, in some senses seemingly unanswerable to no one other than the European Commission, and an elected European Parliament that seems to be answerable itself to none of the constituents who elect them from the member countries either, to be telling them how they're to live, how they're to produce, how they're to interact. And the additional influences, of course, without going into the minute detail, has been the recent Greek financial crisis, where some wealthier countries were expected to subsidize countries that had showed financial irresponsibility through their governmental budgets. And then, of course, without getting into that issue completely as well, of course, this mass migration of people escaping from wars or poverty in the Middle East and North Africa of over 1 million people in 2015, which has caused a lot of cultural tensions. But the bottom line is that a growing number of people in European member countries have felt chafed and irritated and slighted by sort of this politically correctly telling them what to do from the most profound to the most minute. There have been countries that have been backlashing this. Now, in Great Britain, this occurred a few years ago with the conservative coming in government under David Cameron, promising that if they were brought into office, a few years down the road, there would be an election, a referendum, on whether Great Britain should stay within the European Union. Well, those years passed, and Cameron had to keep his promise, and so now there was this referendum. And as I said at the beginning, the vote was taken this past Thursday, and approximately 52% of the voting public voted for Great Britain to leave. Now, as I point out in the article, Uh, this can either be an easy withdrawal or a difficult withdrawal, depending upon the negotiations that occur between Great Britain and the European power structures in the other member countries, possibly even over the next 2 years. That's sort of the framework if a country wants to leave. But most importantly, as now is the case between the European Union and some non-EU members like Norway, you could just have a free trade agreement with them, in which not all of the privileges and certainly not any of the burdens of the Brussels bureaucracy have to fall upon you, but they could just have a free trade zone without all of the other political and interventionist paraphernalia, or a great part of it. If each side just says, let's have this an amicable divorce. But the real issue for Great Britain is, as I sort of point out in the latter part of the article, is that the decision to withdraw from the EU and the tentacles of European Union bureaucracy control is the beginning and not the end, Jacob. Because the real issue is here, what will the British people do with their now greater self-governing authority freed from Brussels? They could follow one path, and that path would just to be doing what comes out of Brussels, but now more in London. More intervention, more regulation, more redistribution, more political correctness, which Great Britain has had enough of its own over the decades, but just intensified without it being from a foreign location in Belgium. Or, as has been the ideal, at least of some of the Leave leaders who have been in the Conservative Party, that freeing Great Britain from the Brussels tentacles of control would enable Great Britain to follow a more free trade, a more free enterprise path domestically, a lowering of taxes, a reduction of regulation, an openness to innovation and enterprise through lower taxes, and a government that was less intrusive in people's lives. Now, if Great Britain chooses to follow the latter course, freedom and free enterprise, that means that Great Britain can have liberty and prosperity as its future. But if they use the escape from Brussels to merely follow the same interventionist welfare statist political correctness paths, but just homemade from London, then it will have been a worthless endeavor and a futile escape. But that means that it's in the hands of the British people whether they're to follow freedom or their own version of intensified collectivism. And as I end the article by saying, history waits to see the outcome.
Yeah, very good. So it seems that the original idea of the European Union was somewhat based on the model of the United States, where
Mm-hmm.
here in the United States you have borders between the states, but people are free to cross the borders and goods and services are free to cross. You have free trade and open migration between the respective states.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds to me that was the original concept of the European Union. Come into the Union, and people, French can go into Italy and vice versa, and Great Britain and so forth, and you can get jobs there without getting permits and green cards and all that nonsense. But that while the migration part has turned out great up until the time of this refugee crisis, where people have been very happy with it, it seems like,
Mm-hmm.
but
Yes.
the they just got mired down in all of the historical mercantilism and economic regulation that has long
Yes.
characterized mankind, really.
Yes.
And so you got the British under this direct control of this huge non-elected bureaucratic agency.
Yes.
And as you point out, now it's be interesting to see what happens. From what I can tell, the European Union is already lashing out and is going to retaliate, punish the British with some kind of extreme economic controls,
Mm-hmm.
protectionism in a sense, to send a message to everybody else that don't even think about doing this, because this is
Right.
what we'll do to you too.
Mm-hmm.
But as you point out, the best thing the British could do is what we've been advocating Americans to do: unilateral free trade, unilateral open your borders, whether
Mm-hmm.
others punish you or do these bad things to you,
Mm-hmm.
so be it. But let me go. I want to go into a little bit about the what impact this has on the U.S. Because as I wrote in my blog today, is that we
Mm-hmm.
have an opportunity to do some soul searching over here, and what
Mm-hmm.
I'm arguing is that the U.S. ought to do some post World War II soul searching in terms of exiting from NATO and the national security establishment. And the New
Mm-hmm.
York Times had an interesting article that I linked to in my blog, where they talk about this post Cold War, post World War II reordering that might be taking place now,
Mm-hmm.
that the U.S. And Great Britain essentially imposed on much of the world. And but they don't get it. You alluded to the fact that the refugee crisis was a precipitating factor here. I think
Mm-hmm.
it was an enormous factor. And
Yes.
and what is it that brought about that refugee crisis? Well, it was U.S. interventionism in the Middle East. This is what the New York Times doesn't get, that it
Right.
was the invasion and occupation of Iraq. It was the Libya regime change operation against Gaddafi. It's
Mm-hmm.
the arming of the rebels and NATO's bombing in Syria and so forth that have
Mm-hmm.
given rise to this enormous chaos that
Mm-hmm.
produced this refugee crisis, which ironically then plays a major role in the vote of Brexit.
Mm-hmm.
I think, Richard, if there had been no refugee crisis, these million refugees in Europe, that 52% would have probably fallen below a majority. I think there's a very strong likelihood they would not have carried it. But it was that refugee crisis that I think was the precipitating factor to carry it over the majority. In other words, if there had been no refugee crisis, I think the vote may very well have been different. So here you have the irony of the post Cold War era, the post World War II era, with this huge national security establishment, which was brought into existence to wage the Cold War, that is the precipitating factor that brings about this refugee crisis. I argued the same thing on NATO. I mean, what do we need NATO for? The same Times article that I linked to said, oh, well, the crisis in Ukraine shows that we need NATO more than ever. That's the insinuation. But that ignores the fact that NATO played a major role in bringing about the crisis with absorbing all those Eastern Europe countries, going all the way up to Ukraine, threatening to absorb Ukraine, which clearly would have meant U.S. military bases on Russia's border. As I say in my article, what would have been the reaction of U.S. officials if the Warsaw Pact had stayed in existence and absorbed Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, Chile, Mexico, and started putting military bases on Mexico's border? So you've got these two World War II apparatuses, NATO and the national security establishment, that I would say, while the British have done some soul searching and doing some fundamental re-altering of the post-World War era, I think it's time for Americans to do the same type of soul searching and re-altering.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. That the problem with the post Soviet era in Eastern Europe was not necessarily per se the Eastern European countries joining the European Union. Again, this is separate from the bad things about the European Union. I'm referring to the desire of the former Soviet bloc countries in Eastern Europe wanting the opportunity for free trade with Western Europe so they could recover from a half a century of communism, their desire for freedom of movement, which they have been enjoying through the EU agreements, basically. A lot of Poles, for example, tens of thousands of Poles, for instance, live and work in Great Britain because of this freedom of movement within the Union. And that in itself would have probably irritated Moscow, but it wouldn't have resulted in the anger and resentment and sense of, if you will, betrayal by many Russians if that had not been accompanied by NATO. There's a difference between an economic interdependency and integration among willing citizens of different countries versus a military alliance.
Mm-hmm.
But what one has to understand is that, in fairness here, America may have instigated it, but it was welcomed by these countries. After having lived under communism for more than half a century, the Baltic republics, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, all of them were paranoid and fearful of Russia, even without communism. And they leapt at the chance. There was no hesitation, no second thoughts. In fact, they were begging from their own side to be let into NATO. So, in fact, given that the United States and some other NATO countries were open to extending the alliance, and those countries were so eager in sort of a defense psychology after having lived under Soviet domination for so long, to want to be under a shield that would seemingly protect them from a return of a Russian threat. That decision is the one that I think has precipitated or intensified a lot of the problems between the United States and Europe and Russia. If that had not happened, the situation would have been different. Economic integration, but necessarily without a military alliance. Now, as far as the refugee thing, I think there is no way to deny, just looking at the past 15 years, there's no way to deny that the sequence of events that you enumerated, the invasion of Iraq, the disintegration of the political structure in a post-Saddam Iraq, the emergence of the Islamic State, first in Syria out of that civil war, where we kept making threats and red lines that we would do things to the Assad regime, and then us, however, but belatedly under the pressure of some European countries and some on their own, to start arming these rebels. And then both the Europeans and the United States determined to topple Gaddafi, and that country falling apart politically and economically, and opening that to the Islamic State as well, set the stage of such chaos. Now you could say that it's all unintended consequences. There's no doubt. People in Washington didn't say, "Oh, let's cause total, like nuke explosion of social disaster in the Middle East." I mean, their naivete is their belief that they can remold the world in their desired image. They're internationalist or global social engineers. That's their danger and their blindness. But the unintended consequence is that these countries disintegrated. And let's face it, if there's no food and no running water and there is disease, and if besides the bombs and the bullets flying, you're concerned about protecting yourself and your family, and you try to get out of harm's way. And admittedly, millions took refuge in Turkey, in Jordan, in Lebanon. By the way, no refugees, zero. I mean, the literal zero, were taken in Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirate, who were pushing the U.S., to go after Islamic State. Okay, but the fact is that those countries generously, neighboring Iraq and Syria, generously took refugees. But the spillover, inevitably, because of the ballooning number, then started flowing into Europe, and all of this tension. And you can make the arguments about freedom of movement, and people shouldn't be afraid of people per se coming with different cultures or different religions. But given the reality that people get uptight about these things, right? We're just talking about human psychology here. People get uptight about that. Once that flow started into Europe, and people became frightened because of these cultural and psychological things, this tension about is the European Union a way to protect our societies? Are we losing control of our own countries? Exactly as you said, set the stage, which eventually became a platform for the referendum in Great Britain.
Well, let me ask you this now. What do you see with respect to the euro? I mean, we know that there's this huge crisis with Greece. I mean, that thing is long from over, and
Right.
they bailed them out with what seems to me massive amounts of debt. How do you see any effects here on the eurozone from this unraveling, at least this Brexit vote? I mean.
Well, Europe has been recovering extremely slowly from the 2008-2009 recession. They've had persistently high unemployment, much higher than anything in the United States. Now, you can argue about how the U.S. government measures unemployment and whether it's really higher than the official number, but the fact is, European unemployment is massively high. On average, it's 10% throughout the European Union. Some countries are much higher, some are lower. Germany has a lower unemployment rate. but growth has been slow and stagnant since the crash. Now, the response of the European Central Bank, the central planners of the euro, the central planning agency and planners of the euro, basically has been to do a policy similar to what Ben Bernanke and now Janet Yellen have been doing over in the United States, uh, flooding the European markets with euros. That is central bank monetary mismanagement, in my opinion, uh, that has distorted financial markets, has pushed interest rates not just after adjusted for inflation, but in the real nominal sense, uh, below zero. Uh, this has, without a doubt, created a huge, massive distortion and imbalance between savings, investment, spending decisions, investment decisions. So, as a consequence of this, and the determination to keep pumping more money in until they hit their desired target of 2% price inflation, as measured by a European version of the Consumer Price Index. And they're just doing this, which is setting the stage not only for this massive overhang of created money, but the danger of significant price inflation down the road, because it's much easier to pump money into the economy than to pull it out. Because once you start pulling it out, you bring down the house of cards that your own monetary expansion has created in this unsustainable pattern and structure. So I think that the euro itself, now matching these uncertainties with the European Union, are going to be plaguing Europe as well. Whether the euro lasts or not, that's another matter. But I don't think that it's going to be smooth sailing for the common currency.
Yeah, and it's very interesting that the Germans are part of this because the Germans have always stood for financial soundness, monetary
Yes.
soundness, with the German mark. And it was one of the reasons why the Swiss stayed out and kept the Swiss franc, because they were concerned of
Yes.
losing control, and the British did too. They kept the pound,
Yes.
and so yeah, it seems to me that there may be some more unraveling that's taking place here. The New York Times article raised the prospect of people may start questioning apparatuses like the World Bank, the IMF, these old post World War II apparatuses that really the fruits may finally be becoming rotten after all these decades that we may that to mix metaphors that the chickens may be coming home to roost finally.
Yeah, but what we need to keep something in mind. Um, if one is an advocate of individual liberty and limited and decentralized government as a institutional companion to preserving liberty, as classical liberals and libertarians do, it is very easy to become euphoric. Oh, these centralized structures are falling apart. Oh, first Britain leaves the EU, maybe then some other countries, and then so on and so on, as you're suggesting. But we have to remember this, that there are two undercurrents going on right now. And one is people who resent this unrepresentative and centralized power controlling their lives. Uh, what seemingly, when people have been asked, has been a prime mover in the leave vote in Great Britain in this referendum. But there's another undercurrent here, and that is there is an emergent hyper nationalism and protectionism. Because for many people who have been chafing under these centralized rules and regulations of the European Union structure, they say this elite, this unrepresentative, body of managers and bureaucrats, they talk about, neoliberalism and an open world. And look what this is doing. They're screwing over our lives with all these controls, imposing this upon us from Brussels. You see, they're looking at it in a way differently than you or I would hope many of our viewers would, as people sympathetic towards classical liberalism or libertarianism. As a consequence, they're interpreting this means globalization, free trade, and liberalism. So people are responding, however, factually incorrect and logically inconsistent. They're responding in some home countries with an attitude of nationalism, protectionism, xenophobia. So tragically, the weakening or even the crumbling of, let's say, more or even all of the European Union might not mean a free and free trade Europe, it could be that many of the countries fall into nationalist protectionism and hyper xenophobia that will just create problems for Europe, just of a different type.
Yeah, well, you alluded to that earlier when you talked about Great Britain. Is that they may come get out from under the yoke of the European Union, only to have their own system of protectionism and economic regulations and mercantilism. And well, let in the time we have left, let's outline the libertarian vision here, because I mean, obviously, Americans don't have any much control over what's going on overseas, nor should we want that type of control. But we do have control over what happens in our country, and as we've long argued, we have the ability to lead the world out of this statist morass simply by example. And we stand for free trade and open immigration where people are free to interact with each other. At the same time, we stand for non-interventionism, no invasions, occupations, assassinations, regime change operations that gets the world all riled up against Americans. In other words, bring all the troops home, close all those military bases, restore a republic to our land, and then have a free market domestically and a free market internationally. I mean, this really, if we can do that here at home, imagine as the world looks around, says, "Oh my gosh, look what the American people are doing. They are doing an adjustment toward freedom, economic liberty, the likes of which mankind has never seen before." And then they start marveling at what we're accomplishing in terms of peace, prosperity, harmony. But it really takes economic liberty. We've got to be enshrining economic liberty alongside freedom of speech and freedom of religion, freedom of the press, and so forth. And I think by leading the world, we can do a lot here at home, Richard.
Yes, if I can just compliment that, many of our viewers and listeners would be familiar with the famous Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises, a staunch and very principled and uncompromising advocate of free markets and a free society. And over the middle decades of the 20th century, when he both lived in Europe and then looked at European affairs from America after having emigrated to America during the Second World War, he always emphasized that there is an overblown conception that peace and prosperity can come through international organizations, a League of Nations, the United Nations, this trade association, that trade association. He always emphasized that what is most fundamentally important is a change in attitudes, beliefs, and political philosophies. As long as people believe in various forms of collectivism, whether it be socialism or fascism or the milder forms of the interventionist welfare state that gives government both the responsibility and the duty to heavily regulate, control, into society, there is no chance for peace between nations. You don't need international organizations to have free trade, freedom of movement, freedom of investment. What you do need is a philosophy of liberty that, regardless of administrative boundaries on a political map, the private citizens of each nation are free to live as they want, trade with whomever they find it advantageous to do so with, invest wherever they want, travel, live in, and work wherever they want. And therefore, boundaries become of no importance other than just the administration of who's responsible in a particular area for police and courts. But what's important is a philosophy of liberal peace. And if that dominates more or less most people's thinking, then governments will just lower their barriers, as you were saying, unilaterally, and the world will have a global free trade zone without the heavy-handed imposition of bureaucracies that often become twisted and dominated by social engineering attitudes and beliefs.
Yeah, that's great. And as you pointed out earlier, the British really have an opportunity to do this because they have their heritage of Cobden and Bright.
Yes.
Richard Cobden and John Bright, who led the free trade movement in England
Yes.
and really introduced the concept of free trade and to the world
Yes.
and brought it to the world. And they have Adam Smith, the Scottish philosopher and economist, with the great book, The Wealth of Nations. I mean, they really have an opportunity here, right?
Yes. They have an intellectual legacy of the last 250 to 300 years. In fact, let's go back even a little further, not just the economics, but the politics. Let's not forget that John Locke was a British philosopher. And he is the one who, in its modern form, said that each human being has a natural right to their life, their liberty, and their honestly acquired property, and that the government exists to secure these things and not to violate or plunder them. And that itself, Locke's vision, was a major ingredient to the philosophy of the founding fathers in the words in our own Declaration of Independence. Britain was the modern home of freedom in many of its facets, and leaving the European Union, if rightly taken advantage of, could reestablish it and inspire the world once more.
Oh, okay. Now, on that great note, we'll sign off. Greatly enjoyed the visit with you again, Richard.
Me too.
Yeah, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, and we'll see you all next week.